rieche nicht!
Ist die Luft rein? Sind wir sicher? Alles klar!
Over a 30-year period, from 1914 to 1945, more than 100 million people will die in the bloodiest conflict the world has ever seen. But it all began in the slums of Vienna. At age 25, Adolf Hitler is a poor loner and aspiring artist, struggling to survive. Both his parents are dead, leaving Hitler truly alone in the world.
He was a lost soul. He wanted to be an artist, but he couldn't get into the art school, and he ended up living in a flop house.
Left without any means of support, his only way to make money is selling paintings around town for next to nothing.
Hitler didn't have a plan B when he was rejected. He just didn't know what to do, so he started to drift. He had very little money. He was living a hand-to-mouth existence. He had no clear aim in life at all. He was, in a sense, waiting for something to happen.
Before long, a chance event 450 miles away will change everything. June 28, 1914. An assassin takes down the Archduke of Austria-Hungary. The murder ignites a deadly conflict that quickly erupts into war. From the tangle of alliances, two sides emerge, Britain France and Russia become known as the Allies, while Austria-Hungary, Germany, and the Ottoman Empire form the Central Powers. Filled with a patriotic sense of urgency, men on both sides rush to join the fight. For Hitler, it's the opportunity he's been waiting for. He quickly rushes to enlist.
He tried out for the Austrian army. He failed the physical. He wasn't considered strong enough to carry a rifle.
Rejected by his own country, Hitler turns to the German army, who's accepting almost anyone, as they work to build the largest fighting force in the world. Germany has finally given Hitler what he's always wanted: a place to belong.
I think that the decision to enter the military for most people is not a decision to serve. It may be in a very general sense, but it's more often because something else is motivating you.
Zwei! Drei! Vier!
Throughout August of 1914, Hitler trains as a private in the German army.
Well, the German army was considered to be the finest army in the world. It was a massive force, well-equipped, well-trained, and very well led, and Hitler was swept away. Being part of the German army was something that Hitler deeply loved.
The structure of training transforms Hitler into a devout German soldier. Hitler joins 1.5 million Germans marching towards the French border and the unified Allied forces. In the history of warfare, armies this large have never met in combat. 6,000 miles away, America has nothing to do with the war in Europe. They're in their own war with Pancho Villa. The Mexican revolutionary is carrying out violent attacks on U.S. citizens along the southwestern border. But he goes too far. Villa and his men seize an American mining train, brutally killing 16 innocent Americans, leaving the U.S. military no choice but to take action. Nearly 5,000 American troops cross the Mexican border to take down Villa. But fighting a guerrilla force with a traditional army is next to impossible. One army captain is determined to find a different way. His name is George S. Patton.
Patton's ancestors fought in the Revolutionary War. They fought in the Civil War. He grew up wanting to be a military hero. He has a reputation for being smart, tough, and for being ruthless. But he had another quality that's essential in military leadership. He understands the power of technology, and he doesn't want to fight with cavalry and with horses. He's looking for a new technology that will change the nature of the battlefield. So the car is fairly new. If you strap a gun to a car, you've got a new instrument of warfare.
What Patton doesn't know is that he's about to revolutionize warfare.
I think Patton knew only one direction, and that was forward. He had a lot of charisma. He was a very colorful leader. I thought he was very egotistical. And that's fine as long as you translate that into good leadership, but maybe a little bit over the top.
Almost immediately, Patton is able to put his plan into action. And he launches a surprise raid on Pancho Villa's camp.
Faster! Got him on the run, go! Faster! Get down! Go, pick it up!
The bandits are no match for Patton and his mobile army. And by the end of the fight, 3 of Villa's men have been killed, including his second-in-command. The first use of motorized warfare by the United States Army is a huge success. And for Patton, it's the first step in his rise to greatness. Half a world away, 2 massive armies collide on the battlefield. In the first major war with modern technology.
When you look at World War I, it's about machine guns and, all of these sorts of new killing mechanisms. It's the beginning of the 20th century as a tech era. This is not men on horseback anymore. This is a motorized war.
The advanced weaponry turns the conflict into a slaughter. 230 men are killed each hour. 1 death every 15 seconds.
Really, the machine gun probably did more than anything else. They found that if they dug even shallow trenches and used machine guns, a small number of troops could stop a large attacking force. And then both sides started to dig trenches. And so they were locked along this line, the Western Front, which was this extraordinarily complex set of trenches that didn't move very much either way.
The trenches cover 25,000 miles. Laid end to end, they would circle the globe. The area between the trenches is so deadly, it's known as no man's land. Among the German soldiers stationed in the trenches along the Western Front is Adolf Hitler. But even after months on the front lines, Hitler's still seen as an outcast.
Hitler was regarded by the other troops as something of a loner, something of a rather peculiar, eccentric person who kept to himself.
But what Hitler lacks in popularity, he makes up for in blind ambition.
Command wants this taken to the 3rd Battalion. Now!
Yes, sir.
Hitler's role as a messenger was actually considered perhaps the most dangerous task in trench warfare. Running from trench to trench, exposing himself to enemy fire The mortality rate for messengers was quite significant.
The Germans are retreating. Adolf Hitler's been injured, and he has this encounter with Private Henry Tandy, a British private. Tandy has Adolf Hitler in his sights. And even though he's a trained soldier, he can't bring himself to pull the trigger. If Tandy had pulled the trigger, Adolf Hitler would have died on the battlefields in World War I, and the whole course of human history would have been changed. It's one of the great what-ifs in history.
The world wars have begun, with Britain, France, and Russia squaring off against Germany and the Central Powers. Modern weaponry is causing mass devastation on the battlefields. And tens of thousands of soldiers are now living in overcrowded trenches.
Very soon after the war began, both sides realized we can entrench, and the other side can't move us out. They can move us backwards a little bit, but only at horrendous cost. And as a result of this, the war just bogged down in the muds of northern France.
But in London, one man is convinced he can break the stalemate.
He comes up to the barman and says, I would like a...
Born into one of the wealthiest families in Britain, he's risen through the ranks at unusual speed to become the head of the British Navy. His name is Winston Churchill.
Churchill had the most enormous self-confidence, and it's easy to see why that was the case. He was the son of Lord Randolph Churchill, who was a brilliant politician, and so Churchill, from a very young man, saw himself, almost by divine right, as playing a leading role in politics.
Churchill forms a bold plan that he's certain will change the Allies' fortunes.
He, even at that point, considered himself a strategist. And he looked for ways to break the stalemate in Western Europe rather than just to get more armies and more artillery. And it actually is fairly thoughtful.
What if we could send the fleet to the south, into the Black Sea?
Resupply the Russians, Well, yes, exactly.
But there's no way.
Well, yes, there is. Through Gallipoli.
Gallipoli? No.
This is our way in.
With all due respect, we are here to provide
This
information.
is what we are doing.
A lot of the people Churchill worked with thought he was a man of contradictions, a maverick, a loose cannon. He was known as someone to watch. His friends would say someone to watch because he's very talented, and his enemies would say someone to watch because he's dangerous.
The Gallipoli Peninsula is heavily guarded by the Central Powers. Churchill's plan is to blast through the narrow strait, pushing through to Russia, and allowing the Allies to launch an overwhelming attack from the east, opening up a second front against Germany. If it's successful, the Allies will be able to turn the tide of the war and crush the Central Powers. More than 100 warships set sail for what will be the largest amphibious invasion the world has ever seen.
People often ask me, what's the most difficult decision you've ever made? It's always the decision of sending men into battle, and the worst part of it all is the night that the battle begins. Because you know you just launched something, and you know that within a few hours, you will start getting calls from the battlefield, from your commanders out in the field, that will tell you how many young men have died.
Yes? They're halfway up the straits.
They should have broken through by now.
They'll make it.
4 ships sunk. Another burning.
Losses were to be expected.
The fleet is requesting permission to turn back.
They are to press on at all costs. This is war.
Gallipoli, I don't think, could ever have worked. The troops who stormed ashore were met by a hail of machine gun fire and artillery, and the casualties were appalling.
The invasion is a devastating failure. 56,000 Allied troops are killed, and nearly 200,000 are reported injured or missing. Almost no ground is gained, and the supply route to Russia remains closed off.
I think Churchill's credibility after Gallipoli was certainly called into question. Warfare is not a science. The one thing you do know when you commit to warfare is it's going to be horrible.
The public is outraged by the carnage. Someone will have to take the blame.
It's over.
The plan was sound.
Excuse me?
The plan was sound. All we needed to do was keep pushing
I'm afraid
forward.
your services as First Lord of the Admiralty are no longer required. I'll expect your letter of resignation in the morning.
When Churchill was let go, he thought his career was over, finished. And that wasn't melodrama on his part, and he could be melodramatic. It appeared that it would be finished. It's hard to imagine Churchill being humbled by something like Gallipoli, but he was chastened. He thought, never again. The next time, if there's a next time, and it didn't look like there would be, I'll do it right.
Defeated, and humiliated, Churchill's career is all but ruined. He's offered a desk job, which he turns down. He knows if he's ever going to redeem himself, he needs a new path. So Churchill does the unthinkable. He enlists in the British Army and heads straight for the front lines. While Winston Churchill looks for redemption, Germany looks to capitalize on its victory at Gallipoli, devising a plan to eliminate the Russian threat once and for all. The Germans load a secret weapon onto a heavily guarded train, headed for Russia. It's a weapon that promises to destroy their enemies from the inside out. That weapon is Vladimir Lenin. Lenin is the leader of Russia's communist revolutionaries, hell-bent on toppling the Russian Tsar. For the past 10 years, he's been in exile in Switzerland, until Germany sends him home on a train, along with over $10 million to fund his revolution.
The Germans decided that they would take this enormous gamble and bring Lenin back to Russia to bring about a revolution to get Russia out of the war. That's about as radical a step as you can take.
When Lenin gets to Moscow, he's greeted by an old friend. 6 times he's been exiled to Siberia, and 6 times he's escaped. His name is Joseph Stalin.
Comrades.
Comrades.
Let me show you to your place.
Reunited, the two play right into Germany's plan as they begin to plot an armed rebellion. Over the next few months, Lenin and Stalin recruit a massive workers' militia. Using the $10 million from the German government, they quietly amass a stockpile of weapons until they are ready to make their move.
I have arranged to take the train stations and the telephone communications.
And the palace guard.
Many of our sources say they are sympathetic to our cause.
Our timing has to be perfect.
The communists storm the Winter Palace, toppling the Russian Tsar. The Soviet Union is born.
This is just the beginning, comrades.
Just days later, Lenin signs a decree that takes Russia out of the war. The German plan works, bringing them one step closer to victory. Europe is at war, and in a bold move, the Central Powers have ended the fighting on the Eastern Front, sending exiled revolutionary Vladimir Lenin back to Russia, where he seized control of the country and took the Russian army out of the fight. Germany can turn its attention to the other allies, and one of the countries now forced to fend off the new wave of German soldiers is Italy. Italy joined the fight in 1915, and now must face the full might of the German army for the first time. Tens of thousands of troops are rushed to defend the Italian border in the Alps. Among them is a sharpshooter named Benito Mussolini.
Before the war, Mussolini is an anti-war activist. He's a journalist. He's pretty much a pacifist.
The time spent defending Italy's border makes Mussolini hungry to return Italy to greatness.
Mussolini becomes a very different person than he was before the war. His whole attitude toward his nation and his role in it changes. He develops this hyper sense of nationalism, this real pride in his country.
The horrors of war have transformed Mussolini into a ruthless killing machine, a trait he'll take back with him to Rome. 600 miles to the north, in Belgium, the British Army digs in. Since the beginning of the war, nearly 400,000 British soldiers have been killed, just to be replaced by new arrivals. Among the new recruits is a man battling back from the biggest failure of his life. Winston Churchill.
Churchill took responsibility for everything he ever did in his life. He never passed the buck. He was humbled, humiliated by Gallipoli, and he had to do something. And he put himself in harm's way and volunteered to go to the trenches. It was a very dangerous thing to do.
Move! Go!
Sir, 2nd platoon lost this main trench.
Get me the multitude from the West Reserve now!
You get the hell scared out of you, first of all. First time I got shot at was, hey, this isn't a game. This is for real. This guy really missed me and he killed somebody else, but tomorrow he'll try to kill me. As we say in the military, that opens your nostrils.
With British casualties escalating, Churchill is quickly promoted and discovers he has what it takes to lead men into battle. For a man of Churchill's ambition, it's the first step towards redemption.
In his heart, what Churchill always wanted to be was the great warrior, the great hero. Here he was, commanding a mere 800 men, whereas he dreamed of directing the battle destinies of millions.
The fight seems unending.
No.
Until Germany unleashes a secret weapon.
Incoming! Gas! Move! Move! Run away! Go! Go, go, go! Get on!
the fight between the Central and Allied powers has become the bloodiest war in human history. By 1917, nearly 7 million British, French, and German soldiers have been killed.
Gas! Go!
It was a war of attrition. You had to kill as many of the enemy as you could so you could possibly advance. Chemical warfare just enabled that in a very horrific way.
England and France are growing desperate for a way to alter the course of the war. So they look to the one country that could finally tip the scales in their favor. Until now, President Woodrow Wilson has kept America out of the war.
Wilson recognized that the American people did not want to get involved in a war, particularly if it's a war far away involving people and for causes that we had nothing to do with. Frankly, the American people did not see themselves at immediate risk.
But with hostilities escalating, a peaceful solution seems less and less likely. And Wilson's advisors urge him to begin preparing military forces. Among them is the 35-year-old Assistant Secretary of the Navy, Franklin Delano Roosevelt.
Mr. President, I recommend an immediate allocation of more funds to our naval resources if we want to maintain military preparedness.
Wilson found himself being drawn closer and closer to war. In the spring of 1915, the British liner, the Lusitania, was sunk, and on board were over 100 Americans. Now, this was a big deal. Until this time, it had been a European war, but now in this European war, Americans were getting killed.
American resentment grows against Germany. And on February 26, 1917, it finally reaches a boiling point.
Mr. President, I think you should look at this right away.
The United States intercepts a secret telegram from Germany, intended for the Mexican government, containing a shocking proposal. The Germans are offering to fund a Mexican invasion of the United States that would allow the country to reclaim the border states of Arizona, New Mexico, and Texas.
The German ploy was preoccupy America with the war with Mexico, and therefore you keep them out of Europe. Well, this incensed a lot of Americans, and rightfully so.
The U.S. government releases the contents of the secret message, and almost instantly, anti-German protests erupt all across America.
The Zimmerman telegram was one of the stupidest things the German government ever did. Texas didn't care about the war in Europe. Now, all of a sudden, the Germans are trying to return Texas to Mexico? Enough with Germany. They need to be taught a lesson.
President Wilson signs the declaration of war in April of 1917. Germany's plan to keep America out of Europe completely backfires. The Americans may finally be ready for war, but their military isn't. The U.S. has a standing army of only 100,000 men, while the German army has 4.5 million. The United States hurries to build its military, and those few with fighting experience are rushed to France. George S. Patton has been presented with a huge challenge: to command a battalion of American men using the latest form of military innovation. The tank.
Some American generals were really resisting the tank because they didn't want to get rid of the horse cavalry. George Patton understood the power of the new technology of mobile and armored warfare, and he invested a lot in that.
The tank is already being used on the Western Front, but with little success. It runs out of gas too quickly, gets stuck in the mud too easily, and its sheer size makes it difficult to incorporate in military maneuvers. But where others see an insurmountable challenge, Patton sees a chance to prove that his tanks can break the stalemate.
I think innovation comes between the ears. It's not about the gizmo. It's about how you think about using technology and so forth. You have to give credit to people like Patton that experienced World War I, that had been thinking about how to employ new things.
Patton knows the stakes are high. But with his battalion of tanks, he's determined to win the war, or die trying. The war rages in Europe as the Allies fight to hold their ground against Germany and the Central Powers in the sprawling system of trenches.
Things are ugly in World War I. Europe was staggered, exhausted, many cities in rubble, starvation, disease were widespread. You know, the Red Cross couldn't even keep up with what was going on. If you were the Allies in Europe,